In the summer of 1991, a handful of Holocaust survivors assembled at mass graves across the Lithuanian countryside. They came to commemorate the friends and family who, 50 years earlier, lost their lives at the hands of the Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators. Once a vibrant Jewish community of 250,000, less than 7% survived the Nazi genocide in this small Baltic nation. Today, fewer than 1,000 remain. Fanya K survived the war by hiding on farms and then as a nun in a series of Catholic old age homes. Since the age of 23, she has lived without the Jewish community and the culture she knew as a girl. Today, an assimilated Lithuanian, she is a remnant of a lost world. In Portland, Oregon, Fanya's nephew, Professor Nathan Cogan, was making plans to travel to Lithuania to discover what was left of the Litvak world.
I was on a personal mission when I went over there. I wanted to meet with my aunt Fanya over there. I wanted to find out what had happened to her during World War II and during the Soviet years. It's important to understand that as a child of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants to America, I had a sense of a past that was very much alive. My father had supported his parents there in the 1920s and 30s. And so with the mass murder of the Lithuanian Jewish community, including my father's family, there was a sense of wanting to connect up with Fanya, meeting her two children and her husband, going back there to, as it were, to link up our roots.
Professor Cogan traveled to Lithuania just as the Baltic nation was gaining its independence from the Soviet Union. In Kaunas, known as Kovno to the Jewish community, Cogan and his wife Sarah met with Fanya's family. Her 2 children and 3 grandchildren were all on hand to meet their American relatives for the first time. The next day, the family traveled west toward Fanya's hometown of Telš. The group stopped in the town of Varnay, Fanya's childhood home, to visit Dora Talat Kelpšienė, also a Holocaust survivor. After 2 generations of Soviet rule, most Jews no longer know the prayers, rituals, and language of their people. So Dora's traditional Jewish meal was a true treasure brought out for the foreign guests. With their friend Zita, Fanya and Dora are among the handful of Litvaks living in this entire region of the country. On the outskirts of town, Dora is restoring a 300-year-old cemetery desecrated in the war and since left in ruins. It is here that both her and Fanya's fathers are buried.
When we cleaned up the graveyard, it took us 13 truckloads to remove all the rubble and debris.
Returning home after the war, Jews found everything they knew destroyed. Restoring the graveyards, which serve as a living memory to the past, were among the first cultural projects Jews embraced after the fall of the communist regime.
The stones which are under grass are the oldest, and they date back to the 18th century or maybe even earlier, maybe 17th century. But they had no possibility to clean up the remaining area.
Before the war, Lithuania's Jewish community was among the most vibrant in Europe, known for its artists and some of the greatest minds in science and religion. In 1940, Vilnius, or Vilna, had 121 synagogues and houses of worship, and Kaunas had 6 Yiddish newspapers. In these cities, Jews made up a third of the population. Fanya was anxious to show her nephew the pre-war pictures of her own family, all of whom were murdered. She recovered the priceless mementos from a local photographer after the war. There was her older brother, Meyer, her father, who died a year before the war began, and her sister Sora Mira's 6 young sons. Fanya was especially close to her sister, who helped to raise her, and cherished the small boys. It is still very painful for her to speak about the loss of her family, but she opened up when speaking of her teenage friends. Fanya was especially animated about her best friend, Shana.
Shana Glass had a wonderful singing voice. She went away to the Riga Conservatory. She married a pharmacist with a limp and moved to Panevicius. She was murdered during the war. It was a very tragic life.
An avid singer, Fanya remembered a Hebrew tune she used to sing with her friend Shana. Fanya's family lived a quiet life before the war. Her father was a shoemaker and a small farmer. While anti-Semitism existed, Jews and Gentiles lived side by side without major strife. A picture from the 1930s shows her nephew with his Lithuanian friends. Ironically, their older brothers may have manned the machine guns that murdered the little boy.
I remember once, right before the war, there was a warning that people were starting to attack Jews. When I was at the tailor having a dress altered, a young boy came in and said, "Don't go home by yourself. I will walk with you. They are saying that Jews kidnapped a boy and cut him up." All day Lithuanians were going around breaking the windows of Jewish families with their wooden shoes.
On June 22, 1941, the German army stormed across the eastern Polish border in the infamous Operation Barbarossa. As the vaunted Soviet army retreated, most Jews knew that they were in danger, and those who could escaped east. Life was never the same for Lithuania's Jews. Dmitry Gelpernis, a leader of the Jewish community and a survivor of the Kovno ghetto, vividly remembers the night when the Germans arrived.
On coming home, I immediately sat down beside my radio and started switching channels. It was about 6:30 in the morning when I heard Hitler's speech in which he resolved to attack the Soviet Union. He was quite frank about it. He said, "I attacked the Soviet Union because communism must be stopped and Jews all over the world must be finished."
In the first weeks of the war, Fanya hid at the home of a local farmer. Her unique ability to speak Lithuanian without a Yiddish accent helped her avoid detection. Later, Fanya returned to Telch to see her family who had been rounded up in the ghetto.
When I returned to Varney, I couldn't find my family, so I went to the ghetto looking for them. My sister and mother told me, "Since you are single, don't come with us. Run away and hide yourself and you will stay alive." My mother accompanied me a short way, and as she walked back toward the ghetto, she turned many times to look at me.
Going back into hiding, Fanya was one of the few lucky ones. In the days before the crematoria, the Nazis simply organized mass killings. Daily, men, women, and children were marched from the ghettos to the countryside where they were machine-gunned. Though some brave Lithuanians put their own lives at risk to hide Jews, only 1/2% of the country's Jews were saved by their Gentile neighbors.
What's called Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22nd, 1941, was absolutely devastating on the ancient Jewish community of Lithuania. Over 200 Jewish communities were destroyed. People were rounded up. They were shot. in mass killing fields almost immediately. So that what we have discovered is that nearly 175,000 Jews were murdered between mid-June and the end of December of 1941. And the Nazis themselves kept the records of who they killed. That's why we have those numbers.
Over the next year and a half, Fanya traveled east across the country working on a series of farms. Eventually, she ended up at a Catholic old age home in the small town of Anikshe. On his trip, Cogan traveled to Anikshe looking for the home where Fanya lived. Life in the home was traumatizing for Fanya. She did the laundry, sang in the church choir, and was, in exchange for being hidden, forced to be baptized as a Catholic. Few at the home knew her true identity, and she lived in constant fear of discovery. She acted the part of Sister Teresa for the next 2.5 years.
It was a very hard role for me to play. The war had depressed me miserably, and I knew that maybe my sister was to be shot, maybe my brother and mother too. It was hard to act that role, and having to fake all that religion and Christianity. I would often think about my mother and my parents and relatives. They were just as good as these people. I had to ask myself, should I become a Christian just so I am not shot? It was painful every day.
Since perestroika, Jews have been returning to the mass graves, many unmarked, to mourn. Fanya took us to the mass grave at Rene, where she believes her own nephews were murdered.
From Plungea and It's a big job to kill 7,000. It's a very intense job and crowds of people. And I think that a barrel of vodka also. Machine guns and barrel of vodka. And as usual, Germans commanded and organized that.
Now, were these Lithuanians willing collaborators or unwilling?
It was mixed. Some of them were horrified with what they are doing. Some of them were willing. Some of them tried to forget that, getting drunk in the evening. And they had no other way but to obey the commands and to do what they had to do as policemen or soldiers. They were looked after by German officers.
So that there
It was very mixed.
It was mixed, so that
Mixed
humanity...
feelings, mixed motives. Yeah, some of them committed suicide. They couldn't do that.
Overall, Lithuanian society is only beginning to acknowledge its role and responsibility for the extermination of its Jewish citizens. At Ponar, the most horrible site of mass killings in the country, where more than 100,000 people were executed, this reality became very apparent.
Ребята, а кто вам разрешил здесь копать, а? The children said that the director told them to dig up the earth because to find some sculpts or anything for the museum, for his museum. And they don't know exactly who is buried here, but they have heard something about Jews, Polish people, and the Lithuanians having been killed here because it was war. And the Germans killed them because they hated them, and it was war. You are not in America.
I understand.
You are not in America. It's quite another world.
Ja, niet maar goed, de ga jij gaan, nooit in,
memorials are extremely important in the lives of almost all of the survivors that I met. I found that most of the survivors over there were, in effect, going through a symbolic ritual of reburying the dead. They didn't mourn the dead during the war, and since the Soviet occupation, they were able to go to the cemeteries and freely grieve and heal their wounds. And the other element to this, of course, is that it's communal. They'll often go with friends who survived the war. And in that sense, they're restoring a sense of their Jewish identity. They're affirming it as a result of memorializing and paying homage to their loved ones.
While Fanya lives in the countryside, most of Lithuania's Jews relocated to Lithuania's capital, Vilnius, after the war. As a result, Vilnius is the center of the resurgence in Jewish religious and cultural institutions that began in 1988. Today, there is even Jewish programming on television. Despite a high emigration rate to Israel, assimilation into Lithuanian society, and grim economic prospects, there are Jews who want to remain and believe that Jews have a place in Lithuania's future. One is Mark Zingeris, a Jewish poet who writes in Lithuanian.
Is there a future for young Jewish Lithuanians?
Well, if you treat them like Jewish Lithuanians, there will be more Lithuanians than Jewish, since we have only one Jewish school which teach Hebrew and English from the first form. They will be assimilated. They will be free to keep their Jewish identity if they wish. I think they will, culturally, they will identify themselves as Jews, but politically and socially, they will behave as Lithuanians.
Others, generally the older generation, are less confident. Grigorius Smolyakov, a Holocaust survivor and publisher of Lithuania's only Jewish newspaper, is pessimistic about the rebirth of Jewish culture.
I envision our future as a beautiful tombstone. Even if 1,000 Jews remain here, they won't have the ability to continue the original Jewish culture. We only want to fix things, whether it is by building a museum or erecting a memorial plaque or replacing the name on a street. We cannot be creators because we no longer have a corresponding atmosphere. If after the war the Soviets had allowed us to develop our culture to the level of 1940, then a new generation could have grown up out of the 6% remaining. But Jews in Lithuania have undergone a spiritual genocide, a spiritual killing these last 50 years.
Fanya returned after the war to find nothing of the life she knew. She was utterly alone. Her family and close friends had been murdered, the synagogues burned. She buried the past deep inside her and began to forge a new life.
At the end of the war, I had nothing, not even a pair of shoes to wear. I had to find a way to survive, and I had no family to help me. How many times I thought about trying to leave. In those years, I often repeated to myself the address of my brother's family in America. But I had to survive in Lithuania, and I did the best I could.
In the Soviet Union of the 40s and 50s, there was no freedom to be Jewish, so Fanya focused her energy on caring for her 2 children and avoiding the Gulag. Like many survivors, she married a non-Jewish Lithuanian. But even though she hid her Jewish identity, it remained with her. Her 2 children grew up with little connection to their Jewish heritage. Her grandchildren have almost none. Fanya's daughter Wanda was given a specifically non-Jewish name to help her through life. While Fanya makes trips to the Kaunas synagogue on the Jewish high holidays, her intermarriage to Leon, typical of survivors, has meant a double existence, both an acceptance of Lithuanian culture and a nostalgia and yearning for a lost Yiddish community.
She had to assimilate. She had to, as it were, give up her Jewish identity as a way of maintaining a degree of sanity in a very complex society. Fanya, in fact, I would say is very representative, perhaps very symbolic of the survivors that I met over there. Tremendous survival skills. And not simply being able to speak perfect Lithuanian, but enjoying life at the same time. She learned Lithuanian folk songs, and she's participated in a Lithuanian choir for years. I suppose that's a way of adapting to an environment that had been, at one point, very hostile to Jewish culture. Of course there are regrets, but I think at the heart of it is a kind of bittersweet experience.